And thank you all for coming here today. I know you all have very busy schedules, so I really appreciate that you're taking the time to come and engage with me in this discussion about neoliberalism, collaboration, and community arts education. This is a project that's evolved over the last few years with my collaborators in the University of Auckland, who are also on the Arts Equal project. That's Dr. Rosemary Martin and Associate Professor Ralph Buck, and also with Eva Antilla and some of the work we've been doing together on looking at the impact of neoliberalism in arts education. But today I'm going to tell you a bit more of a thrilling story. It's not going to be just a very hard, academic, dry presentation, but it's going to be more of a rescue mission. It's got some really interesting and diverse characters. First, we've got the victim, which is collaboration. I'm going to tell you all about that victim first. Then we have the hijacker, which is neoliberalism in tertiary education. I'll tell you a bit of the background and profile that perpetrator. We're then going to look at the detectives, Arts Equal, and how we've approached this crime. And we're then going to look at the daring plan, the community arts pedagogies that we're going to use to try to rescue collaboration from the dastardly hands of neoliberalism in tertiary education. This is currently in press as an article within Higher Education Research and Development, and it's the great neoliberal hijack of collaboration, and it's a critical history of group-based learning in tertiary education. So, going into that, what is collaboration? What is this treasured element that we're talking about here? Well, collaboration, firstly and foremost, is something that's collective. It's dialogic. It involves multiple individuals engaging with each other in a dialogic way towards something. What is that thing they're moving towards? Well, ultimately, it's towards an innovation, a creative act or problem-solving act that somehow brings about something new into society that didn't exist before. In doing so, collaboration is inherently iterative. That is, it goes through cycles of evolution. It doesn't seek to propose in a sort of a modernist way a master plan in advance, but recognizes that these ideas have to adjust as a result of that dialogue between the various partners involved in the collaboration. Ultimately, collaboration is also self-actualizing in that the collaborators, those involved, engage in a creative act that allows them to gain a greater sense of their own personal becoming. Collaboration is also very important for bonding. It helps enhance a sense of significance amongst a group of people and a sense of solidarity amongst that group of people. So we can see that collaboration is quite a complex phenomenon, quite valued and quite important. As Ray Lynn here, and I've got quite a few references scattered all the way through this presentation. Feel free to just take photos or take them down if it's useful for you. But ultimately identifying that it's something new or unique might arise from a mutual inquiry that could reconstruct the participant's view of reality. So central to that idea of collaboration is that people entering in collaboration are open to change, that they're going in with the idea that they don't have the solution already preset in their mind, but that they want to work with others that may shift their view of reality towards understanding that change. But let's go deeper. Let's understand, what is collaboration? Well, it's a form of social interdependence. That is, it relies upon us having relationships with other people. Now, we might see there's various forms of social interdependence. A very common one, and the dominant one within education systems, is competition. And competition is a form of social interdependence, like a tennis match. A tennis player cannot win a game without having an opponent. They rely upon someone else. But central to a competitive interdependence is the idea that someone can only achieve their goal if someone else loses their goal. It cannot allow two people to achieve the same goal. Oh dear. We lost that. Ah, and it came back. Okay. Alternatively, we might have a promotive social interdependence. That's where different individuals can only achieve a shared goal if by working together and both achieving the goal. If one achieves the goal and the other doesn't, then they don't actually achieve that goal. Or we have a non-interdependence in which might be a situation of two people both climbing up a mountain. One might get to the top, the other may not. Doesn't affect the other one. So kind of like a tennis match. Two people going in a canoe down a river. They both need to get to the end in order to get there. Or two people climbing a mountain. So these are different forms of social interdependence, and they matter when we look at, well, what is collaboration? Where does that fit within this? It's a form of promotive. It requires people to work mutually together towards a goal in which they cannot compete because they need to both arrive at that end point. Now, within those promotive relationships, it breaks down even further. We might see that a promotive relationship can simply be cooperative, or it can have the more complex phenomenon of being collaborative. Within a cooperative relationship, people might be working in parallel, they may not even communicate with each other. As in an industrial line context, and an assembly line context for building something, people may just do their part, cooperate with someone else. Cooperation is deeply valued within the Industrial Revolution as a means of enhancing productivity. Collaboration, by contrast, its goal is ultimately about enhancing innovation. It doesn't necessarily make productivity better, but it does allow for more diverse ideas to come forward, and that's why it's engaged in. And ultimately, therefore, it's valued very much within the knowledge economies of the 21st century because it's very much focused on design strategies. So, within collaboration, we can see there's some fairly key phenomena that are very essential. For a collaboration to function, there needs to be what Dillenburg describes as three symmetries. One is a symmetry of status, that those engaging in the collaboration, during that moment of collaboration, maybe they do have forms of status in terms of being bosses or workers or higher or lower within a command chain at different stages, but in that moment of collaboration, they're saying, okay, nobody pulls rank, we recognize each other's equality within this location in terms of contribution. That moves to a symmetry of knowledge, recognizing that all knowledges are equal, that they do not have to necessarily have, well, this one knows more and this one knows less, or this one has a better cultural knowledge than this one's cultural knowledge, but that all might have something valuable to contribute into the collaboration. And finally, there has to be a symmetry of actions, that it has to take place in a location in which everyone can equally contribute, not in languages or through technological platforms or in forums in which collaborators do not have that equal access to participate. Now, all of this becomes important when we look at what happens to collaboration later. Another fundamental aspect of collaboration is that it involves pluralism, that it functions on this level, on a very political level, as we see from Hannah Arendt. It values the idea that we want actually multiple perspectives on a phenomenon and not a singular perspective. We're trying to move away from totalitarianism through collaboration because we seek to say, actually, the phenomenon's too complex and we need diverse viewpoints. It therefore is not about trying to get a common denominator ideal that will hold everybody together, but trying to actually foster complexity and diversity. So that means when we're coming into the collective decision-making processes of collaboration, which are really the most core aspect of that collaboration, how the decisions are made, rather than being made on truth, that is a group of people using a common form of logic, maybe mathematics, to try to identify what is the right answer, and there can only be a singular right answer. And not using majority, in which we just try to get, well, who believes in it the most, and we'll just go with that, what's the broadest consensus on that? But actually seeking within decision-making processes pluralism. How can we aggregate diverse viewpoints into the solutions so the solutions and the innovations are complex rather than singular? And again, this becomes important later when we look at how collaboration is functioning within tertiary education. Ultimately, why we engage in collaboration is also a very important thing. And we can see within motivation we have very extremes of extrinsic to intrinsic forms of motivation. There's a whole spectrum between those as to what actually makes us do it for ulterior motives or for the function of actually wanting collaboration to work in and of itself. Now, studies have been done looking into this, and those that seek more intrinsic form, that is fostering social capital, say it can promote knowledge sharing amongst partners because they possess the common values, enabling them to build a community of trust. People are collaborating because they want the collaboration itself to work, because they want that social capital to grow. That's a phenomenon that exists between them. Or, on a more extrinsic end, it can be more like an economic exchange. When a person feels that the obtained rewards are more than the cost, she will share her knowledge. In that context, someone will be extrinsically motivated to collaborate and give and contribute if they feel they're going to get more out of it or as much out of it as they put in. However, results from studies that have been done into how different people collaborate and the contributions they make overwhelmingly show that when somebody is doing it for a sense of social capital, for a sense of actually they want the organisation to grow, then the contributions are richer, stronger, and more complex than when they're doing it purely on an economic exchange model. So we see here that collaboration in and of itself intrinsically values the idea of social capital.
No, there's no signal.
No, there's no signal. Okay. Let me just pop back.
Sorry.
That's okay. That's it.
That's
Okay.
interesting because
Okay. Oh, I'll pop this through. So, it's therefore deeply valued as a 21st century graduate attribute. And tasks like collaborative problem solving is seen as one of the key test beds for assessment of 21st century skills. But more important than that, as we look at a social phenomenon, if we don't have collaboration, our social and our professional relationships have to fall back to either being competitive or cooperative, which means we ultimately need a managerial process that's happening outside the relationship between the people in order to steer and direct the outcomes of that interaction, or they're non-existent. We just don't interrelate. So collaboration is a deeply valued and deeply important phenomenon. Now, let's look at the hijacker. Neoliberalism. What is neoliberalism? It's got many different meanings, or is interpreted in many different ways. I'm just going to basically focus it on this, which is creating privatized citizens who care primarily for themselves. The privatized consumer-led citizenry of the neoliberal model are rooted on a culture of insecurity that induces anxiety, competition, and an indifference to those more vulnerable than themselves. Other people may have a different interpretation of neoliberalism, but this is the one that I'm going to adopt for this, for the purposes of this argument. Now, within that, let's have a look at what neoliberalism means within the context of education.
that is a problem of
So, within education, we can see that neoliberalism underpins the idea of doing learning for the sake of private advantage or personal advantage, that we're gathering knowledge for the purpose of trying to advance our own agenda or accumulate our own wealth, status, and knowledge through learning. Now, this has been a massive shift in education, and we can see it if we move from the 1970s through to the 1990s. That's it.
next.
Okay, and next, yeah. The discourse on learning has shifted from learning to become employable and productive. And that's quite an important key in terms of how we consider the function of education. And we can see already how neoliberalism as an ideal is encroaching into that space of education. But what does it mean when we apply it to collaboration? How has that affected the learning of collaboration? Okay.
Let me try turning this.
Okay. Can I just pump to the next slide?
Yeah.
Okay. One of the key things we see is the way that neoliberalism has appropriated cooperation and promotive relationships for the purpose of benefiting learners. This began with Vygotsky back in the 1970s and 80s, and the idea of actually trying to measure an individual's progress, and then moving on to forms of cooperative learning that said, how can we get students to work with each other to enhance their individual learning progress? And that's a very important key distinction to make, that when these students were put to learn together, it was to enhance their individual achievement, not necessarily to enhance their collective achievement. It continued advancing the idea of education functioning to enhance an individual's own accumulation of knowledge, wealth, and status. Now, that focus on that instrumentalization of cooperation into learning became quite predominant through the 1980s and 1990s. But then in the 1990s, we saw a shift away from actually learning through collaboration and learning through cooperation to learning to collaborate. And this was in response to the 21st century skills that were emerging that were saying, we need to actually have employees who can graduate, or graduates who can move into employment contexts who are able to effectively collaborate. Now, herein lay the problem. At this stage, collaboration therefore became a target of higher education, because suddenly people needed to, if it was going to be a quality that they were going to be graduating with, it had to be qualified. And that qualification relied upon assessment measures. And so suddenly people had to start looking at, well, how good is this person at collaborating? And in doing that, within the context of a neoliberal education system that was seeking to measure the independent individual capability of people, and that being the contract that had emerged between the teacher and the learner, saying, I'm here to measure your individual capability, collaboration started to become a form of a quality that had to be assessed. Now, in that process, sorry, I just have to see all my notes here, and I keep losing them because I black out. We might see there was different forms of assessment emerged over the following 2 decades, some which were group assessments, in which they said, okay, we're just going to assess the group of you 4 together, and you'll do a project, and you'll go and do a problem-solving activity, and then you'll come back and we'll have a look at and give you all the same grade, depending on what your project is like. Or we had individualized, so the 4 would go away and work together, and then an individual grade would be given to each. Or the 4 would go away and work, and just maybe the leader of that particular group would be assessed on that collaborative project. Now, within this process, and within the vast majority of the literature on assessing collaboration, the predominant focus has been on assessing the collaborative product. That is saying, well, what have they emerge? When they go off and do a software engineering development project, when they go and do a literature assignment, and they come back, let's look at what they produced and see what that grade is worth. There was less consideration of the actual process. However, a lot of student complaints emerged relating to a sense of free riders and social loafing. And so we started to have a lot of the development of assessment tools focused on monitoring free riders. And it's remarkable the volume of assessment tools that have been developed online, in which higher educators can monitor students' contributions online, where students have to contribute by sending emails to each other, and the teacher can assess the number of emails, and then they'll say, this one's contributing more because that person sent 80 emails and this one sent 3, so therefore this one gets an A, this one gets a D. And it's a very quantitative, reductive approach to it. Now, they say that they do it more qualitative because they take in measures like, this one did more at this stage in the process, and this one did more at that stage. But however it is, it's still measuring a very singular formula. What it doesn't take into account is that collaboration is far more complex than just giving contributions. It involves other aspects, such as how you're taking other people's perspectives, how you're accommodating divergent viewpoints, how you're engaging in social regulation to ensure that the collaboration in and of itself functions. Instead, it was purely measuring individuals' contributions. Now, as a result of that, collaboration became a site of competition. And if we can get it up, I've got a wonderful quote here from one of the peer assessment tools in which students were expected to assess each other. And this one's from Splat. I'll read it out because it's from a very proud new tool that's been developed and presented for the digital measurement of contribution. And students have to put on peer reviews of each other and measure each other continually. And so it suggests if you are pulling your weight, your PAF will be 1.0. A PAF of greater than 1 indicates that you have put in more than average, while scores of less than 0.8 indicate that you need to put more work in. However, you shouldn't worry excessively if your PAF is between 1.1 and 0.9, as to reward a student who has put a lot of work in means that other teammates get less than an equal share of the 100 points, and therefore gain a PAF slightly less than unity. So students are actually competing with each other in order, and being measured by each other in order to identify how well they're collaborating. And as I explained earlier, that's kind of antithetical to the whole idea of what collaboration is about, and pushes it very much into that extrinsic zone of doing it as a form of economic exchange. So this has basically identified that higher education, through its neoliberal mandate, has ultimately drawn collaboration from this domain of collaborative activity in which people engage in together because they believe in the common mutual goals of the group, to an action in which someone is continually measuring and considering how good they are and how much they're contributing to that collaboration. And as we've identified, people who engage in it in that way in professional contexts are much less valued So actually the university is producing graduates under the guise of saying we're teaching them collaboration, but actually they're pushing them further away from it. So it's a deep dilemma. If as a tertiary institute we are saying we are growing students who have this skill, and yet we're actually pushing them away from it, we're engaged in a large deceit. So, what do we do about it? It's such a shame this is gone because I had really nice fonts to show. So now we're going to the investigation phase of this study. We've seen who the victim is, we've seen who the perpetrator is, now we're going into the investigation. And here we did, a couple of years ago, a comparative analysis between software engineering and dance studies of students at the University of Auckland. Now, within this, it actually emerged at a coffee line queue. I was standing next to someone who worked in software engineering, and he was talking about, we're both talking about how we had collaborative tasks going on, and he was saying, oh, look, it's just our type of students just don't like collaborating, and it's the bane of our existence. We hate it when they have to do these tasks, and they have to do these tasks. And I was saying, no, actually, that's great. That's really the fun. That's the richest part of our learning when students get together. And he argued back and said, no, well, it's probably just because yours inherently are demographically different, which was a kind of a racist way of saying and a sexist way of saying, well, ours are predominantly female students, and we have a large proportion of Indigenous students, and his has a large proportion of male and Caucasian students. Now, and that somehow those inherent qualities and those who are inherently drawn to software engineering don't like collaborating, and those who are drawn to dance do. So we thought to question, well, are some students just inherently collaborative and others not? And are these differences based on gender, ethnicity, or disciplinary interest? And ultimately, might the way collaboration is taught affect experiences of and attitudes towards collaboration? Because ultimately that is my underlying hypothesis, that the way we teach collaboration has a large impact on how students experience it. So, within this, we wanted to look particularly at student experiences and expectations of collaboration. We wanted to know, how did students value collaboration within their discipline, within their degree, and within their profession? We wanted to know, how did students experience the teaching and learning of collaboration within their degree? And we wanted to know, how did that teaching and learning affect their experience of student and group work? So, in our research, we engaged in a quantitative survey of students from dance studies and students from software engineering. We did qualitative interviews with students and teachers from both disciplines. We did classroom observations and analysis of course structures and lesson plans from both disciplines. And we did a review of educational literature in both disciplines to understand how was the whole idea of collaboration conceived within these disciplines, taught within these disciplines, and experienced by students within these disciplines. Now, within this, we saw that there are, despite these significant demographic differences among students, so we had, as I said, a predominance of female students and Indigenous students within dance, and a predominance of Caucasian and male students within software engineering. There was no significant difference in how they valued the idea of collaboration. Groups, in both of the groups said, no, actually, we equally value the idea of collaboration in our degrees, in our workplace, in our discipline. There was, however, a very significant difference on how students experience the learning and teaching of collaboration. Students in dance studies experienced a really, they noted the teachers' enthusiasm for it, they noted the teachers providing explanations and theoretical ideals on it, and they noted the way that they were being assessed on it. In distinction to those in software engineering who were saying, no, actually we had quite low scores gave quite low scores for all of those qualities. There was also a significant difference between the groups on how the students actually experienced the collaboration within the coursework, with the dance study students overwhelmingly enjoying it, and the software engineering students overwhelmingly not enjoying it. And there was a significant difference between the groups on how the students valued the learning and teaching of collaboration, in which the students in dance studies recognized that they were taught and learned about collaboration, and students in software engineering saying, no, we didn't get anything out of that in terms of learning about collaboration. So, within the qualitative results, that is from our interviews and our classroom observations, we also saw there were significant distinctions between the disciplines in the teachers' attitudes towards collaboration and its activities and assessments, with the dance studies teachers generally quite enjoying that, and the software engineering teachers admitting they didn't enjoy it at all and they didn't like it, and it was their biggest phobia within the teaching of their course. And they were only actually integrating it because they had this mandate from the profession that they had to start teaching this discipline. There were significant distinctions between the disciplines and the teachers' therefore approach to teaching collaboration. But there was a shared enthusiasm from the students for the deliberate teaching and collaboration within the disciplines. That's it. Students in both groups said, actually, yeah, we both really like the idea of being taught how to collaborate. So they didn't just value the idea of collaboration, they valued the idea of teaching and learning about collaboration. So, the big conclusion, this might come as a real shock, but that is how collaboration is taught can impact student experiences and student attitudes towards collaboration. So, as a result of this investigation, we started to devise our rescue plan. How are we going to save collaboration from the evil clutches of the Neoliberal Institute? And the most obvious one, well, we need to look at these community arts pedagogies that we're teaching in dance studies. And how might they be transferred into other disciplines? Not transferring the discipline of dance, but transferring the pedagogy. How might this be developed into a professional development program for academics so that others can actually see how they can integrate the teaching and learning of collaboration? How might this involve redesigning courses and assessments? And how might, through this process, we might start dragging the tertiary institute, particularly the STEM and the rapidly growing neoliberal aspect of the STEM university, towards a wider understanding of why collaboration matters and how it can be taught. So, first we looked at community arts pedagogies, which is central to the pedagogical philosophy of the dance studies program. In that way, it's quite distinct from, say, a conservatory dance program, which can be equally neoliberal in its format, but this is one based very much on humanizing pedagogies and Fourierist values and socialist principles of how dance can function in a society to bond and bring people together. And looking at community animation practices and that idea of community animation coming from the belief that the goal of doing an arts project in a community is to bring the community together, not to enhance the quality of the art form or to enhance the quality of artists within that group of people, but to actually enhance the quality of community within that group. So, from there we developed what we call the Salam micro-credential. And it's a real shame we don't have the PowerPoint now because it's got a really nice graph and shows how this lays out, but I can share this with you at a later point. Within this, the Salam, which stands for Socialized Animated Learning to Activate and Motivate, is a philosophical system that approaches the teaching of collaboration and says there's 5 key pedagogical responsibilities for teaching collaboration. And we've developed this into a micro-credential and now taught it to a group of academics within the University of Auckland engineering faculty, and we have forthcoming deliveries of this program. It's a 4-day workshop going into other disciplines and other faculties across the university to help academics gain a greater sense of how they can integrate collaboration into the coursework. Because we also recognise it's not because people working in STEM disciplines are inherently evil or neoliberal in and of themselves, but it's because they themselves have not had much training in what collaboration means and how to go about engaging in it. So, these 5 key points, I'll just go through them briefly now, are first explicit metacognition. And what's very clear is that within the interdisciplinary workplaces of the future, we cannot rely on tacit knowledge as much as we previously could. In contexts where people would all kind of know the same thing and so they could share the same idea, when we have different cultures and different disciplines coming together into a space, people need to be able to be much more explicit with how they communicate their knowledge and how the whole idea of collaboration functions. And without this explicit metacognition, people fall back to just assumptions regarding what they think working together means. So a central component is understanding these points we talked about before in terms of collaboration being distinct from cooperation, being distinct from competition, being a form of social interdependence that relies upon certain processes. The second point we have within the Salam program is the idea of scaffolding collaboration. One of the overwhelming factors within all the software engineering and engineering programs we reviewed in general is that collaboration and group tasks were only introduced at the point of assessment. That is, students were kept in a large lecture hall, individualized in their own learning zone for 3 months of the course, and then suddenly the teacher would say, okay, get into groups and work together. And we recognize that students do not automatically do that and engage in that way, especially within the neoliberal context in which they've been so told to remain private, keep yourself to yourself, don't share things, that's plagiarizing, don't watch other people's ideas, you're copying and stealing, to then get into a very collaborative state. It involves a lot of allowing and providing of permission to engage with people, more than necessarily a teaching of how to engage with people, because the institute and that forum has so forbidden it in the past. So scaffolding is a key part that means, you have to do lots of small collaborative tasks along the way that are not assessed, that just keep people into the zone of what is it to work with someone in my specific discipline. Our students recognise that they've been collaborating since they were children in playgrounds, but it's very different to then collaborate within the context of designing a software program, which they had been through their training taught to just do very much on their own and individually. So they need to find the mechanisms and the forms of how do you do that collaboratively? What does that involve? Well before they got to a point where they were going to be assessed on that process. The third aspect of the salam involves animating symmetry. That means that the teacher is responsible for actually animating the class, not just saying, okay, get yourselves into groups or randomly put you into groups, but actually saying, okay, how am I going to interact with you and establish a forum in which you can comfortably interact with each other?
Now. I've been pushing that buttons for quite long, but
It's gone. So yeah, and this involves encouraging, motivating, involving, empowering, engaging real human beings in that process. Let's go back to our words. So we had scaffolding. Here we had a student comment which was leading. This was from a software engineering student saying, actually, this is how they want to be learning about collaboration. They wanted to be going all the way through their degree, starting in small groups, just doing activities together. The fourth principle is animating pluralism. And as the student here says, and they provide a very good example of why it matters to them so much that they get to work with difference and not just always be forced into the same. When I went and observed the classes, one of the most dominant things within the software engineering groups was that they were all clustered basically all of the white men together, all of the Asian men together, all of the Indian, all in very homogenous ethnic groups, or those who were domestic Chinese compared to those who were international Chinese. People went like with like, and it involves quite an active involvement of the teacher to make that diversity happen. And as I was mentioning before about those symmetries, animating pluralism also means getting people used to having decision-making processes and activities in which they're having to accommodate diversity rather than just come down to a common denominator. And ultimately then it involves the fifth responsibility is embedding value. Now it's modelling enthusiasm for collaboration within the teaching. One of the things we had to talk to the academics about, and we observed a lot in their teaching, was that they continually emphasised competition in the way they talked. They'd be saying, oh, look, only 10% of you are going to get through this test or such and such, or I'm going to see who's the best and the worst. That there was always a sense that students were being measured against each other, and that had to be removed if we wanted to get into a zone in which students were not seeing each other as competitors, but as people they can work with and effectively. It also means they have to show an enthusiasm in their teaching practice for that process of collaboration. A second form is assessing social skills. How are they actually looking at aspects like participation, perspective taking, social regulation? Maybe they can't do it all within one singular assessment. Maybe it needs different assessment formulas, but if they're going to say they're taking seriously the idea of qualifying collaboration, then they need to look at it in all its complexity. How are they assessing the cognitive skills associated with collaboration, such as planning, executing and monitoring, flexibility, being able to come back and change ideas and respond to different viewpoints, and also learning from the collaborative process so they're growing themselves as reflective practitioners, as collaborators. And ultimately this involves a redesign of courses, assessments, pedagogical relationships between teachers and student relationships. ultimately, what we're looking for this is a liberation from neoliberalism for our the victim of collaboration. So how can we foster social values such as collaboration within an education system that is obsessed with measuring and rewarding individual achievement? How can collaboration become a force to disrupt neoliberalism within education? So we're not just taking it on as how can we reclaim collaboration, but how can we actually activate collaboration effectively and truly within education so it disrupts this neoliberal force? And ultimately, how can community arts pedagogy sustain collaboration rather than succumb to neoliberalism? Because we see as community arts pedagogies are being transferred into the neoliberal tertiary institute, they are having to succumb their philosophical ideals of humanising pedagogies and the fostering of community in order to fit within that neoliberal model of measuring individual achievement. So these are the further research questions where we're moving towards through looking at the tertiary institute from the viewpoint of a community arts pedagogy. I'm sorry that the PowerPoints have not worked so effectively today, but I hope it's given you a sense of what this research has been about. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicholas. Now,